This is America at 250. Due Diligence.
Forgotten Founders.
Quick history question for you, Steve. Everybody knows Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, but who wrote the Constitution?
I think most people would probably say James Madison.
Madison helped shape it, but if you mean the man who actually turned the convention's work into the final text, the better answer is Gouverneur Morris.
Gouverneur Morris, wooden leg, wicked sense of humor, notorious ladies' man, to put it politely, and arguably one of the most important people at the Constitutional Convention.
He spoke more often than any other delegate. He proposed more motions than any other delegate. And at the very end, a 5-man committee of style gave him the job of putting the Constitution in its final form.
He took a sprawling draft, consolidated 23 articles down to 7, changed a great deal of the wording, and did it in about 3.5 days.
Including the preamble, which he basically wrote from scratch.
3 words just about every American knows. We the people.
That's Morris, and most Americans have never heard of him.
Then there's John Dickinson. Before independence, he became America's first celebrity, the internationally recognized leader of the resistance to Britain, according to historian Jane Calvert.
But when Congress finally voted on independence in July of 1776, Dickinson wouldn't vote for it.
He didn't vote against it either.
He deliberately abstained, so he wouldn't stand in the way, and so the decision could at least appear unanimous.
Then he joined the militia he helped raise and train, and marched out to meet the British. Later, he even enlisted in the Delaware militia as a private.
Think about that. One man helped give us the final words of the Constitution. Another helped lead the resistance to Britain, stepped aside rather than block independence, and then went to fight for it.
These aren't footnotes to the founding.
But somewhere between their time and ours, we largely forgot them.
Today, we put them back into the story.
This is Forgotten Founders.
John Dickinson was one of the most prominent Americans of the Revolutionary era. Today, very few Americans know his name.
Dr. Jane Calvert says part of the reason is that Dickinson's papers remained largely unavailable to scholars for generations. In part is the hostile portrait John Adams left behind, a portrait later historians repeatedly accepted.
Then there's Gouverneur Morris, whose disappearance may be even harder to explain. He was one of the most active delegates in Philadelphia and the principal draftsman of the Constitution's final text.
Professor Dennis Rasmussen says he has puzzled over why Morris isn't higher in the founding pantheon, because the usual explanations don't really seem to account for it.
2 founders who mattered enormously in their own time, 2 distinct paths to becoming almost invisible in ours.
Our first guest has spent more than 2 decades trying to restore John Dickinson to the story of the founding.
Dr. Jane Calvert is director and chief editor of the John Dickinson Writings Project and the author of the prize-winning Penman of the Founding, a biography of John Dickinson, published by Oxford University Press in 2024, the first complete biography of Dickinson's life and work. The Writings Project is an effort to collect, transcribe, annotate, and publish a record that other major founders have had for generations.
Her case goes well beyond saying Dickinson deserves a footnote. She argues he was active at every stage of the founding, from 1765 through the ratification of the Constitution, and depending on how you count, he may belong not 7th among the major founders. But first,
Dr. Calvert, welcome to America at 250 Due Diligence. Dr. Calvert, we know of the big 6 of the American Revolution. There's George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, but I think you would argue it should be the Big Seven. Tell us about number 7.
Well, number 7, or maybe number 1, depending on how you want to look at it, is John Dickinson. And my argument for his number 1 position is that he was the only of these people who was in America and active at every stage of the founding from 1765 all the way through beyond the ratification of the Constitution. And at every moment, he was present and active, making really indispensable contributions. And before independence, he became America's first celebrity and was the internationally recognized leader of the resistance to Britain. And afterwards, he continued to hold high office and contribute to the founding of states and the nation. So, really, there's no single person wrote as much for the founding as he did, or was as present and active in high office, directing, the course of events.
But I would imagine 99% of people, or maybe a higher percentage of Americans, have never heard of him, or they forgot about him. Did he have bad PR? What happened?
I guess you could say that. What happened there were myriad reasons for that. You're absolutely right. Very few people know about Dickinson today. But in his day, he was the most, widely known American, Benjamin Franklin, he was well known. Of course, he was famous, but he was famous in more elite circles for his scientific experiments. He was actually a pretty terrible politician, and he was not really considered, sort of an American figure until he changed his loyalties from Britain to America in 1774. But as to why Dickinson is not known today, that's sort of complicated. And one reason is that his papers have not been available for scholars and the public to draw on and write biographies and study. So that I'm trying to remedy that with the John Dickinson Writings Project. So that's one reason. So without that, really people can't know about him, or people have just been able to make things up and the record has never gotten corrected. And the first person who really started making things up about Dickinson, and this is the main reason he isn't known today, was John Adams. And John Adams was an interesting character, to be sure, but he was jealous of no one more than Dickinson. And he wrote a letter it was a letter home to Massachusetts in 1775, and it had an insult against Dickinson. And this letter was intercepted and published by the British. And it made a stir insofar as people sort of united behind Dickinson against Adams, because it was an ad hominem attack on Dickinson's character, and nobody really took it seriously. But then 30 years later, Adams wrote a defense of himself concerning this letter in his autobiography. And when historians got a hold of that, they just took his word for it and never actually checked the sources to see if what he was saying was true or actually happened. And so that's how this really very unflattering characterization of Dickinson kind of got out into the world. And then even to this day, there are historians who, even though they should know better and they know Adams was not a reliable narrator, they still believe this characterization of Dickinson. And so he gets maligned by some leading historians who really ought to know better. And if people want to read about this, there is a forum in the William and Mary Quarterly where I dissect this problem, and we can kind of see some news sources from 1775 that go to disproving Adams. And that's in the William and Mary Quarterly, and it's free and available to the public right now.
I have been a fan of Dickinson for a while now as a student of history, but what really turned it on for me and turned me to him to start reading and start digging into him a little bit was Zelko Ivanik's portrayal in the 2008 John Adams HBO miniseries, What, in your estimation, did that series get right? And what, if anything, did it get wrong?
Well, it got more wrong than it got right. The only way I would say that portrayal of Dickinson is accurate is insofar as it's how John Adams saw Dickinson, but it bears no resemblance to the actual person. So in the first place, just from sort of outward appearances, Dickinson certainly, he had his health issues, as did most Americans of his day. But, he is portrayed in this as kind of really sort of sickly and sort of sweaty, kind of clammy, and, these circles under his eyes, and very kind of negative minded and scowly, and these kind of sunken eyes. And that just is not a Dickinson that I recognize. And also just sort of very, just very negative and kind of dark and unappealing generally. But Dickinson was a charismatic figure. He was a very compelling speaker. He was widely liked. He made friends everywhere he went. He was generally known as being very gracious and very, warm and humorous. And also, he could be very serious as well. But he was someone who people were drawn to him and they listened to him. And that made Adams deeply jealous. Other things about the portrayal: he did not have a Scottish brogue. I don't have any idea where they came up with that. He didn't walk with a cane, didn't wear a wig. He didn't wear fancy clothes with lace and ruffles as he's portrayed. They got the timeline entirely wrong about, certain things that happened. They have Dickinson being sort of persuaded by Franklin and I'm not sure who, maybe it was Adams, to step aside at the vote for independence. But that was absolutely Dickinson's idea, that he said as early as a whole year before the Declaration of Independence.
Let's make something clear here for folks who aren't aware. Dickinson did not sign the Declaration of Independence, and he abstained from the vote, correct?
Correct. And it's very important to know that he abstained from the vote. He did not vote against it. He made very clear a year before the Declaration of Independence that if Congress decided to go that direction, and even if he disagreed with it, which he did, he would not interfere with it. In fact, he would make sure that the vote would at least appear unanimous, which is why he abstained. And then he fully supported it by joining the militia that he had raised and trained, and he led it to the front to meet the British. And not only that, he later enlisted, that was the Pennsylvania militia, and then he later enlisted in the Delaware militia as a private, which is something no other gentleman of his stature did. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, and wealthy men served as officers. They did not serve as enlisted men, but he made a point of enlisting to serve his country and show his patriotism. So, I believe the Adams HBO miniseries does show him riding off to the front, but it's sort of inexplicable after how he's portrayed before that. There's no real explanation given for that. And it's really kind of a shockingly inaccurate portrayal that I think I get asked about that more than almost anything. And it's a shame because, the story is it doesn't make Adams look great, but it's so much more interesting when you have Dickinson as a strong, appealing figure who's making a compelling argument. So anyway, that's my take on that.
One more thing on the Adams and Dickinson relationship, on top of the jealousy, which we've talked about a lot on this series of shows, is the jealousy that Adams has had in his life. Do you think it was also kind of a little bit of anger that he wasn't willing to sign on to the Declaration, and he wanted, for the majority of his time, at least my understanding is, to repair the relationship with Great Britain?
Well, okay, so as far as that goes, Adams turned against Dickinson well before the question of independence was on the table.
Okay.
And he actually started showing jealousy towards Dickinson in the first Congress in 1774. So Dickinson, he helped get Congress to Philadelphia but then he was denied a seat because he wasn't sitting in the Pennsylvania Assembly, and so he was actually kept out of Congress for the first part of it. But he still played such an important guiding role in Congress that he wrote 4 of the 6 documents that it produced. But before he joined, he eventually did join the Congress. And before he did that, Adams was sort of thinking that, the things that he wrote might get chosen and might get, put forth as the documents that Congress produced. But as soon as Dickinson got there, Adams' materials were put aside and Dickinson's were adopted. And that at that point, Adams really turned from fanboy to hater. And because he had been praising Dickinson in his diary, just any time he had any interaction with Dickinson, he was just fawning and praising and kind of gushing. But then when his documents were supplanted by Dickinson's, he turned, and you can see it in his writings. He turned. So then he kind of came back around to admiring Dickinson at the beginning of the Second Congress. And we see again this kind of adulation and praise of Dickinson. But then, he became again annoyed that Dickinson had all the power in Congress and was, kind of doing things and Adams was miserable for other reasons. And then he just lashed out at Dickinson and made up a story that he was frustrated about the olive branch petition, but it had nothing to do with the olive branch petition. And so
that is how it is portrayed in the series.
Well, that's how it's portrayed in the series, because that's what Adams wrote about in his 1805 autobiography, that he claimed that his anger at Dickinson was about the olive branch petition, but it had zero to do with it. When Adams wrote that insult, the olive branch petition had already been debated. It had been signed. Adams had voted for it. He'd signed it. It was over and done with. It was 2 weeks later that Adams wrote that, and he was miserable because he was sick and he was upset with his fellow Massachusetts delegates, and he was frustrated at Dickinson's power. And most immediately, he was frustrated because I think Dickinson tabled discussion of an American Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. And so Adams was upset at that, not at the olive branch petition. That was over and done with.
You touched on one of the contradictions about Dickinson, which is he was seemingly a pacifist. His parents were Quakers, but he was not a Quaker, correct?
He was not a Quaker. He was what Quakers now call a fellow traveler, and neither was he a pacifist. In fact, his parents, I do not believe, were strict. They were Quakers, but they were not strict pacifists, which was a feature of Quakers in the early 18th century. You could be a Quaker, but not a strict pacifist. And so Dickinson had been an advocate for citizen militias since his early 20s, at least, and that was the main reason he would not join with Quakers. It was because he said, I am on all proper occasions, an advocate for the lawfulness of defensive war. And so he was actually at the forefront of raising the Pennsylvania militia. Even though he was only a colonel, he effectively controlled the entire Pennsylvania militia. And he was at the forefront of preparing America for the military defense. He served as, commander-in-chief of first Delaware and then Pennsylvania. And he single-handedly revamped the Delaware militia. He wrote a drill manual. He drilled the troops himself. He had a broader and military experience than George Washington. Dickinson was a formidable military figure in his own right.
He was best known, though, I believe, at the time under a couple of pen names, correct? The Pennsylvania Farmer?
He had I haven't even counted up how many pen names he had, but yes, he wrote so much that, yes, he had, his most famous pen name was the Pennsylvania Farmer. But his other famous pen name was Fabius, although that was less known in his time. But Pennsylvania Farmer is what he was known by from 1768 on. That was how he was best known.
But he wasn't really a farmer, was he? He was a lawyer.
He was. He was. So he was a gentleman farmer. He owned the family plantation and was active in running it. And especially later in life, he was interested in seeds and cultivation. And he was kind of an inspiration for the democratic agrarian societies and the husbandry groups that were on the rise in the early republic. So no, he was, he wasn't a dirt farmer. He did not have, he didn't walk behind a plow with dirt under his fingernails, but he was a gentleman farmer, and everybody understood that that's what he meant. If you read the first paragraphs of the first farmer's letters, it's very clear that he was a gentleman farmer.
At what point in his life, was it during this same time period in the 1770s that we're talking about? Was it a little later in life that he started pursuing abolition efforts?
Yeah, so he always disliked slavery, and it was after he married in 1770 that he started, and I think it wouldn't be unfair to suggest that his wife, who was a very devout Quaker, probably brought out his own Quakerism. And so he, at that point in the early 1770s, he started writing, making it known in his public writings that he thought that the slavery laws in America were illegitimate. And then he tried to get an anti-slavery clause in his draft of the Articles of Confederation in June of 1776. And then at his first opportunity after the Declaration of Independence, when he went back home to his farm in Delaware, at the very first opportunity, he wrote the first manumission deed for his slaves. So he freed them all conditionally in 1777. And so what that meant was they would have to remain enslaved for another, 21 years if they were children, and other conditions. But then he couldn't live with himself. And so he started freeing them unconditionally. And by 1786, they were all freed unconditionally. And he was the only leading founder to free all of his enslaved people during his lifetime. And then he wrote abolition legislation for Delaware and tried 2 or 3 times to get that passed unsuccessfully. So yeah, he was really the only one of the leading founders who can actually be called an abolitionist.
Was there a backlash against that? Because when I read some of George Mason and Thomas Jefferson, who also didn't like slavery, or at least that's what they wrote, but they really didn't want to take the step of actually freeing their own slaves. Obviously, there might have been economic interests as well, but what happened after Dickinson freed his slaves?
Well, I think there were some people who recognized that he had done this and praised him for it. Interestingly, there were some people who did not know that he had done this and called him out for being a hypocrite, for writing the farmers' letters and doing other things, proclaiming liberty. But they didn't know that he'd freed his slaves, and so they were calling him a hypocrite, which is pretty interesting. But there wasn't any backlash against Dickinson for doing that. There was backlash against the Quakers because they were seen as loyalists. Some of them were, most of them weren't.
Loyalists to the crown, the British crown.
Loyalists to the crown, that's right. And so, their big cause was abolition in the late 18th century. And so they lost traction on that because of their being seen as being loyalists. So that was unfortunate. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people, Dickinson included, really did think that slavery was going to sort of die out of its own accord. They watched what was happening in the North, and maybe it was naive, maybe it was wishful thinking, but they said, well, look at these northern states, they're gradually abolishing slavery. And so they thought it would happen with time, and they were mistaken, obviously. But yeah, against Dickinson, there was no backlash against him for doing that.
You mentioned the Fabius letters. What were the purpose of the Fabius letters?
So he wrote 2 sets of Fabius letters. The first set he wrote in 1788, And that was to advocate the ratification of the Constitution. And most people think that the Federalist Papers were kind of what got that accomplished. But actually, the Federalist Papers were written only for an elite audience of New Yorkers, and it didn't even convince them to ratify the Constitution. But the Fabius Letters were 9 letters published in the newspapers, and they were reprinted in, I think, most of the states, and they were directed towards an audience of ordinary Americans, and they are just really an astounding expression of he weaves both sort of classical imagery of Roman ideals with biblical ideals and precepts, and so he really shifts fluidly back and forth between the Bible and classical sources, and it's a very moving sort of exposition of why the Constitution is so vital and so important, how it works, but also what it means to be an American, and how Americans should be conducting themselves in this new republic. And so it's very sort of a nice, sequel in a way to the Farmers' Letters, because the Farmers' Letters were the first to identify like Americans as being distinctly American, having a distinct American identity apart from their British identity, and how it meant to be, what it meant to be an American. And then the Fabius Letters just sort of picks up on that and approaches it from this sort of biblical and classical perspective.
Now, remarkably, you are the one who wrote the first complete account of Dickinson's life and work. And you weren't doing this, obviously, a long, long time ago. In 2024, Penman of the Founding, a biography of John Dickinson, a prize-winning book. I understand you had some real challenges doing the research into Dickinson's writings. His handwriting was really bad?
The challenge is, as I mentioned before, with his papers not being published. So every other founder has, dozens of volumes of their papers that have been, collected, transcribed, annotated, published, and then you can go and just access them online or from a library and open them up, and it's all right there in front of you. And all you have to do is sort of pluck out what you want and use it. Well, none of that had been done for Dickinson. And when I first started the biography, I mean, I've been working on Dickinson for 20 years before that, but we still had not yet published volume 1 of the complete writings and selected correspondence of John Dickinson. We now are working on volume 6. But yeah, and so his handwriting, when he was writing for letters, correspondence, or, something that someone else was going to read, he could be, his handwriting was beautiful. But when he was just writing for himself, drafts and, legal case notes, and it was just, it'll make your eyeballs melt. It's just put your brain into pretzels. And so, yeah, it takes trained paleographers, and a paleographer is someone who is trained to decipher antique or handwriting, and so without those documents being transcribed, and I'm pretty good at reading it now, but you can't skim, you can't, you have to transcribe these documents before you can make any sense of them. And then when they haven't been annotated, when they are legal case notes with all kinds of legal terminology and Latin and law French, which is a combination of English, French, and Latin, you can't, I mean, you just can't make any sense of them. So yeah, it was really difficult to do that, and we had only processed documents from his earliest years, and very little from his later years. So I expect I made mistakes, and that someone will come along and write a better biography in the future, but at least there is something out there now that accounts for more of his life, but still not all of it, still not everything.
It just seems amazing to me that he's such an important figure that no one had done this previously. How did you come across these documents? Were they all in a warehouse somewhere, or did you have to go to different libraries and museums to find them?
Yeah, well, they are the two biggest repositories of Dickinson's documents are in Philadelphia. One is at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and the other one is at the Library Company of Philadelphia. But there are also huge collections in, the Library of Congress and the National Archives and the New York Public Library and, various other places. And so I've, been around the country imaging documents and bringing them back and putting them on a server for my team to access and work with. But yeah, it's been, I started doing that in 2009, and it's been hard.
Dr. Jane Calvert on John Dickinson, a founder whose modern reputation, she argues, was shaped by a combination of missing papers, John Adams' hostility, and generations of historians repeating a version of the story that never really got corrected.
If Dickinson's obscurity has some identifiable causes, that of our next founder may be even harder to explain.
Dennis Rasmussen says he has puzzled over Gouverneur Morris for years. Morris was colorful, consequential, and more than anyone else, responsible for the Constitution's final language.
So why isn't he in the same pantheon as Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson, or Washington?
That's where we go next.
Our next guest has literally written the book on Gouverneur Morris.
Dennis Rasmussen is a professor of political science at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs and the author of The Constitution's Penman, Gouverneur Morris and the Creation of America's Basic Charter. His study of Morris's role in shaping the founding document.
Morris spoke more often at the Constitutional Convention than any other delegate. He proposed more motions than anyone else and had more of them accepted. He also delivered what has been called the first abolitionist speech in American public life to a room that included slaveholders.
And when the convention reached the end, the Committee of Style turned the final drafting to Morris. He consolidated 23 sprawling articles into 7, changed a great deal of the wording, and wrote the famous preamble basically from scratch.
Professor Rasmussen, welcome to America at 250 Due Diligence.
Professor, most Americans can name Madison or Hamilton or Adams or Washington, but Gouverneur Morris is largely forgotten despite being the principal draftsman of the Constitution's final text. Who was he, and how did he end up with that job, that critical job?
So he was really among the most colorful of the founders. Morris was a peg-legged ladies' man with a really wicked sense of humor. He was, without question, one of the funniest of the founders. It's not a super high bar, but he was one of the funniest of the founders, along with Benjamin Franklin. He was arguably the single most important person at the Philadelphia Convention that created the Constitution. At the convention, he spoke more often than any other delegate. He proposed more motions than any other delegate. He had more motions accepted than any other delegate. And as you suggest, he was the one who really wrote the Constitution itself. And this is, it's unbelievable to me that so few Americans know this. Everybody knows. Most American school children can tell you that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. And yet, very few people know that Morris wrote the Constitution, however well-read they might be. I would bet with folks with PhDs in political science, it's a pretty small fraction that could tell you that. Now, so how did he get this job? He was part of what was known as the Committee of Style, which was charged at the very end of the convention with coming up with the final version of the Constitution. It was a 5-member committee, and all evidence suggests that they just had him do it. He was just one member of the committee, but he was the one who wrote it. So he took There's a draft constitution midway through the summer produced by what was known as the Committee of Detail. He took that draft constitution, updated it, consolidated 23 pretty sprawling articles down to a neat 7. He changed or chose a great deal of the wording on his own initiative, oftentimes in I think, pretty consequential ways. And so when constitutional lawyers, scholars pore over the fine details of the Constitution looking for clues regarding its meaning, they have Morris to thank or to blame, as it may be, for many of those details. And he wrote the famous preamble, the Constitution's ringing statement of purpose, basically from scratch. So all the stuff about forming a more perfect union, establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, and so on, that's all Morris. So yeah, it's unbelievable that he's certainly more than anyone else the author of the Constitution, this charter that we still live by, one of the most important texts in world history, and yet few people know who he was.
We should clarify early on here so people aren't confused. Governor is actually his first name, Gouverneur, right?
Correct. So he was named, that's his mother's maiden name. She was a French Huguenot, came from Huguenot stock. So his first name was his mother's maiden name. There's actually debates about how to pronounce it. People did not pronounce it in the French way, Gouverneur, but one of Morris's ancestors suggests it was just governor, the way I've been saying it. Abigail Adams tended to write names phonetically in her letters, and she wrote it Gouverneur. So that, it's unclear how it was pronounced, but I think it did give him a sort of exotic aura that he had this kind of French first name.
He never becomes a governor, but he does become a U.S. senator, right?
Correct. He served half of a Senate term, but was never a governor of anything. No governor.
Why was it that he, being a New Yorker, did he represent Pennsylvania?
So by that point, he had lived, he hailed from New York. He came from a wealthy family who owned most of the southwest part of what's now the Bronx. But he had moved to Philadelphia, I want to say something like 7 years earlier, to pursue business interests. And so he had lived in Philadelphia and hence in Pennsylvania for a while by then. He was actually chosen to represent Pennsylvania against his wishes. He was going away on a business trip, and when he left, he said, "Hey, don't appoint me." And then he came back, and he had been appointed. So it wasn't his actual choice to attend the convention, but once he was nominated, he was willing to do it.
In your book, you refer to him as the Constitution's penman. What does that title capture that delegate or framer does not?
So again, it's that he was the one who wrote it, right? He's the one who wrote the document at the end. And so the committee that I mentioned also had bigger names, more famous today anyway, names like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton on it. But they seem to have trusted him in a way that they didn't trust others, insofar as they trusted him to take on this monumental task of writing the final document itself, which he did, I should say, remarkably quickly. It took 3.5 days for him to write the entire Constitution of the United States. So he not only did his work well, but he did it quickly.
The preamble opens with, "We the people of the United States," rather than listing states individually as some earlier drafts did. Why did Morris make that change, and what did it signal, if anything?
Yeah, so part of it was just more economical. So when he added in all of the kind of substantive aims, forming a more perfect union and the like, it would have been really a long, awkward sentence to include all 13 colonies. But it also had a practical purpose as well, I think. It was unclear if you say, "We the people of the states of New Hampshire and Massachusetts," and so on, as the early drafts of the preamble did. Then there's a question, well, do you have to go back and amend the preamble every time a new state's added, right? Vermont or Kentucky or whatever is added to the Union. Do you have to amend the Constitution to add them into the preamble? It's just kind of cleaner and neater to say, "We the people of the United States." But I think for him, it definitely had a more substantive purpose as well, which was he was a strong nationalist meaning not, America first in foreign affairs, but rather trying to augment the power of the national government at the expense of the state governments. And he wanted to say that the Constitution rested on the people of the country as a whole. It wasn't a creature of the states or the state governments. It was a creature of the American people. And that gave the whole document a kind of more nationalist cast to it.
So Morris was one of the Constitutional Convention's most outspoken opponents of slavery. He calls it a nefarious institution. But we have a clause in the Constitution that protects slavery at that point. The words slave and slavery do not appear. What happened there? He obviously wasn't persuasive enough in regards to his opposition to slavery.
Yes. So his speech, he gives a speech on August 8th at the Constitutional Convention in opposition to the Three-Fifths Clause, right? Counting three-fifths of the enslaved population toward representation in the House of Representatives. And he gives a really blistering speech. It's been called the first abolitionist speech in American public life. It's really quite moving. It's all the more remarkable given that, he's giving this speech to a group of, probably half dozen people or a couple dozen people rather in the room with him. There are themselves slaveholders. It really puts him on the right side of history. Of course, that's something we obviously admire for him, I think rightly today. But, as you say, he's, I think, doing away with slavery would have been an absolute deal breaker for the delegates from the South. There's no, frankly, a realistic chance that he would have gotten his way on that. I will say, though, I think his speech makes him look pretty good from today's perspective. I do think it also makes the other founders look worse by comparison, in the sense that, historians are always reminding us we shouldn't judge figures of the past on the basis of today's values, right? Which I guess is true to a certain extent. But this speech of Morris's makes it harder for me to accept that the idea that, the poor founders, they're mere creatures of their times. They simply didn't know any better. They couldn't possibly have known any better with regard to slavery. But Morris was one of them, and he knew better, and he told them so. It's worth noting in this context, he was a Northerner, of course, but he came from a slaveholding family. His father owned or held in bondage several dozen people when he was a child. His mother still held 3 people in bondage when she died the year before the convention in 1786. But for whatever reason, he's just clear-sighted enough about the evils of slavery. I mean, he fought against it way back in the New York State Constitutional Convention in 1777. When he's only 25 years old, slavery is legal and practiced in every state. So he just, for whatever reason, early on, just saw slavery for the evil that it was.
As we've been putting these episodes together on forgotten founders and some of the names we've considered and maybe using for other episodes and on top of using for this one as well, I can understand, at least in part, why they've been forgotten to history. For the life of me, I don't understand how Gouverneur Morris has been forgotten by history. Why has he been, in your estimation?
It's a good question. I've puzzled over this many, many times. He's so colorful. He's so important. How is he not, kind of rank up higher in the pantheon of our founders? I can think of a couple of possible explanations. I don't really buy any of them. So one is, he was something of an elitist. He criticizes unfettered democracy, and maybe that's too offensive to our political sensibilities today. But, Hamilton is second to none in his misgivings about popular self-rule, and he's a core member of the founding pantheon. He, as I say, he was kind of a ladies' man. He had a somewhat licentious lifestyle, especially by the standards of the day. Maybe that.
Ben Franklin, anybody?
Exactly, right? Yes. So Franklin's eminence hasn't been hurt by that, his kind of fun-loving, amorous ways. And you might think that many in his lifetime would have disdained him because of this lifestyle. But you might think that a predilection for fun and sex and money might be a boon to his reputation today, right? Rather than a hindrance. A couple other things I could think of, right? He never wrote a big book for scholars to pore over, like the Federalist Papers or whatever. But again, Washington didn't. He never held a super high office, right? He was never president or Treasury Secretary as Hamilton was. But he was a senator. He was a minister to France. That's not nothing. And I think Jefferson would be widely remembered today, quote unquote, merely for having drafted the Declaration of Independence, even if he'd never become president, right? Whereas, Morris wrote the Constitution. It's crazy that he's not, still on that same level. So as I often say, I hope that one day he'll be at least put on a par in terms of our remembrance of him with Aaron Burr, whose main claim to fame is having shot someone important.
There's an apparent contradiction about him that I don't understand, so hopefully you can clarify this. He favored a strong executive, but he had reservations about how much power to hand directly to ordinary voters. But he was one of the strongest advocates at the Constitutional Convention for electing the president directly by the people, which technically we still don't do because we have the Electoral College. How do those different positions fit together?
Yeah, it is. So he's a nationalist. He wants a very strong national government. He wants it to be led by a strong president, in part because he really worries about Congress. Congress isn't structured the way he thinks it is. He thinks it's going to be dominated by the rich, by elites. And so he wants a president to be strong enough to stand up to Congress. He also, quite frankly, knows, as they all do, that the first president is going to be his friend, and I don't think it's too strong to say political hero, George Washington. So he very much trusts Washington. So he fights throughout the convention. He fights for a strong presidency. I think he's, along with James Wilson, one of the two main architects of the presidency as we know it, also the Electoral College, our method of choosing a president. So he wants the election to be made directly. He helps to concoct the Electoral College, this kind of a mess of a system that we have, as the best thing that he could get. Most of the other delegates wanted the president to be chosen by Congress, interestingly enough. He thought that would be terrible, that it would just be determined by partisan fighting, factional infighting. He said it'd be like the election of a pope by a conclave of cardinals. And that would just, it would render the president subservient to Congress. This would undermine checks and balances. So he wants direct popular election of the president. He can't get it. Nobody else except for Wilson really will go along with that. So they devised the Electoral College as the closest thing that they can get.
So after the Constitutional Convention, I'm not sure who it was, but who sent him off to France, and he personally witnesses the reign of terror while he was there. How did that experience shape his later political views?
So after the convention closes, well, first of all, he's invited by Alexander Hamilton to contribute to the Federalist, what we sometimes call the Federalist Papers. So it was initially supposed to be Hamilton, John Jay, and Morris, three, they're good friends, they're all New Yorkers. For whatever reason, we don't really know why, Morris says no, and so then Hamilton turns to James Madison. So Madison, one scholar said he's the most consequential backup choice in the history of political theory. So he says no to writing for the Federalist. He doesn't, for whatever reason, fight for the Constitution at the New York State Constitutional Convention. Instead, he goes off to Paris. He initially goes off on business, but then eventually Washington, once Washington becomes president, he appoints him as minister to France. He follows in the footsteps of Franklin and Jefferson. And so he's minister to France during the French Revolution. He's the only foreign diplomat from any nation to stay in the country all the way through the terror. He's quite skeptical of the French Revolution from the very get-go, even before, let's say, Edmund Burke, who's one of the, renowned for being so prescient about it. He did what he could. I think he, frankly, did a pretty heroic job trying to protect American interests. When things are at their worst, he hides people in his apartment to save them from the guillotine. So he spends a bunch of years in France. That does make him, I think, even more. He was already skeptical about too much small d democracy, too much popular self-rule, and that experience certainly reinforced those inclinations.
Why did Morris only serve a partial term in the U.S. Senate and not run for a full term? I know it was a special election that he was elected in, correct?
Well, he was appointed, so he served a second half of a term. So there was a federal senator from New York who stepped down midway through his term, 3 years into his term. So he was appointed to serve the remainder of that term. So he serves from 1800 to 1803. This is a really critical period. Jefferson, the Republicans take power, the capital moves to Washington, D.C., but he just serves a 1 year term, or the 1/2 term. He's, wants to get out of politics pretty quickly after that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about. Obviously, one of the reasons that more people don't know about him is he didn't become a president among the founding fathers. But So he was obviously turned off by politics. He didn't want to be a career politician. What does he do after that?
Good. So he, first of all, right after that, in 1804, there's the famous duel between Hamilton and Aaron Burr. He's the one who sits by Hamilton's side at his deathbed. He gives his official eulogy. Hamilton's widow, Eliza, says, "Morris, you're the best friend he has in the world." And yet he doesn't even have the bit role in the musical, right? There's a whole musical about Hamilton, and his best friend makes no appearance, despite being this.
He's literally written out of history. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Like it'd be such a missed opportunity. I feel like. Anyway, but that was just one quick thing. So late in life, he undertook two more great projects, not as an elected leader, but just as a kind of elder statesman. He helped to lead a commission that planned the grid layout for the streets of Manhattan, the kind of grid that we all know.
We have him to
downtown.
blame. Okay.
We have him to blame. We have him to blame for that.
Yes. Well, it depends on your feelings about Manhattan. But yes,
one city in the world I will not drive in.
It was pretty rural, but there was promise of it expanding pretty rapidly. So he helped to plan the grid layout, and then he led another commission that helped to plan the Erie Canal. I guess it's maybe also worth saying during his very last years as a sort of elder statesman of the Federalist Party, he grew so disenchanted with the ascendancy of the Republicans and the War of 1812 that he supported the secession of New England and New York from the Union. He
really?
Basically, he saw the country being split between forces of light and darkness, right? The light is a commercial system in the North based on free labor. The darkness is an agricultural system in the South based on slave labor. And he thought evil was winning, right? The Virginians and the Southerners were winning every time. And so he said, let them go their own way. Let's have a Northern Union that's free of that.
But it's the Southern states that eventually secede. I was not aware that there was a Northern secession movement.
Yeah, so there was a movement known as the Hartford Convention. This is during the War of 1812, where New England saw the War of 1812. I forget who it was who said that the War of 1812 was fought as much against New England as Old England. So there's a group of people who form a convention, and they, tried to issue demands. Morris thought they were too tepid. He was so disenchanted. He really wanted secession, but the movement didn't go anywhere. And especially by the time the Hartford Convention, I'm forgetting the timeline exactly, but I think by the time they met, Andrew Jackson's rousing victory down in New Orleans, and so the whole anti-war movement fell apart by that point. But yeah, so he was. He's far from the only one to be disenchanted. One of my earlier books was on the disillusionment of almost all of the founders. Basically, all of them except James Madison became disenchanted by the end of their lives. So he's far from alone, but he was particularly disenchanted toward the end of his life.
Well, last question, maybe a thought exercise, which we do sometimes on this show. If Gouverneur Morris were with us today, somehow magically was revived, cured of his many ailments and came back to life, what do you think would be his most vivid observation of our democracy today?
Most vivid observation.
Would he like what he's seeing going on? Would he be surprised at the deep partisan divide that we have in this country?
I don't think he'd be surprised by that. He was one of the very few founders who foresaw the rise of political parties. Most of the founders, for whatever reason, it seems impossibly naive to us today. Most of the founders seem to have been totally oblivious to the rise of parties. The whole Constitution is devised with assuming parties aren't going to come into being. He, in several of his speeches, says just kind of matter-of-factly, of course there's going to be one party who supports the president and one party who opposes the president. He seems to have foreseen that. I do think there are some things that he would be pretty happy about. The power of the national government at the expense of the state governments, the power of the presidency, whether or not he thinks any particular president is exercising that power well. He did want the president to be powerful. I think he would worry about how, for all of its size and might, how sluggish the national government is, how difficult it is to pass major legislation. I think Congress probably would have lived up to his nightmares. He foresaw Congress being kind of what it is, a group of rich people bought by special interests. I think he would not have been at all surprised that a civil war was fought over slavery. So, yeah, I think he was more prescient than many of the founders, and that's saying a lot.
Dennis Rasmussen on Gouverneur Morris, the principal draftsman of the Constitution's final text, Alexander Hamilton's close friend and eulogist, and a man who still doesn't even make the musical.
John Dickinson began the Revolutionary era as what Jane Calvert calls America's first celebrity, and ended up remembered mostly for the independence votes he didn't cast. Gouverneur Morris applied the final language of the Constitution and somehow became an answer to a trivia question.
Different men, different politics, different reasons for fading from view, but both are reminders that historical importance and historical fame are not the same thing.
And maybe Forgotten Founders is less about adding 2 names to a list than asking who got left out of the story and why.
Thanks to Dr. Jane Calvert and Professor Dennis Rasmussen for joining us. I'm Steve Herman.
And I'm Bill Bernardoni.
America at 250 Due Diligence is part of the Radio Free America project and brought to you with the support of the Jordan Center for Journalism Advocacy and Innovation at the University of Mississippi School of Journalism and New Media. Portions of this program are recorded in Washington, D.C. and at the studios of WUMS, the student-run radio station at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi.
Send us your comments online at radiofreeamerica.media. That's radiofreeamerica.media. Executive producers of America at 250 Due Diligence are Steve Herman and Bill Bernardoni. Audio production by Bill Bernardoni of Bernardoni Media and Marketing. For more information, please visit newslab.org. Again, that's newslab.org.
For Steve Herman, I'm Bill Bernardoni. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again next time as we continue discussing the ideas and principles that shape America at 250.